It is Friday, December 13th, 2019. It is 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and so you know what time it is. It's time for a little bit of coin metal. And it was a very special Get Your Ass Kicked at Jiu-Jitsu Friday. We had a little bit of a visitor from another gym. I'm not entirely certain exactly where he's rolling out of. I think it's Nevada or Arizona, one of the two. Anyway, he was one of the guests of one of our instructors, and so it was really cool. I got to do a little bit of work with him. We were working the deep half guard, and it's an interesting thing. I like it because it leaves you in a good position to move to a lot of other things, some sweeps and whatnot. But I think the problem that I was having with it was the entry. At least for the first entry that we did for it, it was kind of weird. It's like, you got to catch the foot and then direct it around while you grab under the thigh and hook it to your head. And I don't know, it didn't seem very natural. But we did do another setup for the same deep half guard, to get to the deep half guard. And that was if we were in a position where we managed to get to turtle and and our opponent was going around to do the back take, to catch one of the legs with an underhook and bring it around and kind of catch the ankle with your foot, bring it on in, lock down that deep half guard, and then navigate from there. And honestly, I enjoyed that position a lot, or I don't mind being in it as much, I should say. It's not exactly an enviable position to be in, but nonetheless, it is a pretty good control position. If you've got a really good lock around that thigh, there are a lot of other things you can move to. You can be trying to flip them over for a back take. You could be trying to open it up for a guard pass, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I kind of like it, and I think that in the longer term, it'll probably be part of my game, that deep half guard. Although I don't know, that, like I said, it does seem kind of like a position you don't really want to get into, honestly. But like I said, I think it's functional, and I found myself in it a few times. I'll be honest, where I was in a turtle position, and I had an opponent coming around the front. Personally, I like to get around the outside of the leg, as opposed to going for a lock from the inside. I like going from the outside in and getting that really, really good seatbelt grab on there. Just like gable grip it in there, and just hold it really tight to the chest, and then force your head towards the gut, and that opens you up towards a lot of opportunities to get around the guard. And of course, with your hands right there, it's not all that big a reach to reach around the outside of the other knee and just pull it along with the leg you've already got on your chest, and you've got yourself a sweep right there. And so I was working that through in the gentleman that I was working with, Coach James. He showed me a really interesting thing. He was calling it like a Habib or something like that, and he was explaining that it's the way that Habib normally gets the leg out from under somebody and gets a sweep, and where he grabs, kind of hooks around the cap of the ankle there and just pulls it on out. Grabs the knee, grabs the ankle, and just pulls it on out. And I thought that was really neat. It was a sweep that was easily available from the position that we were already in. You could conceivably go for this if you had, say, an underhook on your opponent and had your arm, say, wrapped around their waist. You could go ahead and drop it down to the thigh, get that clinch in really tight, and start working it from there. And if you were to be doing that standing, there's some double leg takedown opportunities there, some good sweeps, and all kinds of interesting stuff. So yeah, it was a pleasure to have Coach James in, and get a little bit of information off of him. And it was funny because I kept telling him, like, the way we were going from this one position, it was like a double shrimp and then hooking around the back of the thigh there. And personally, I was going for that, and it seemed like that it was just natural, it was natural from that position to hook around and bring that in. And when I explained that to him, because like I'd asked the instructor, it's like, do you have any like grips on the outside of the leg there? I mean, do you do anything to kind of contain that leg? And the instructor had explained no, and I was like, I don't know, it's just like it didn't sit right for me that I should be in that position and that I shouldn't try and really get a hold of that leg. I mean, because like I said before, it's such a control position. There's so many things you can do once you do have that grip. And so, if I'm already facing my opponent with my head down, like I was in a turtle position, the thigh is right there. Grab it, pull it tight, and if my opponent's on their knees, hell, just grab on the outside of the leg there on 2 points, the ankle and the knee, pull it tight to you from there, and you got to sweep. And you're moving your way around to a side control, and so like I said, that's just like my natural tendency from that position is, get the opponent down and try and go for the mount from there. But yeah, so that was a productive class today. I didn't do a whole lot of ass kicking. The first opponent that I was with for sparring. He's kind of low energy, and that was good because it was the first of 2 sparring matches. He's really playing it smart and conserving his energy, which I thought was a really, really smart move. But he approached it more from a defensive kind of perspective, and I have to admit that he's kind of stocky, and so my tendency to get strengthy on him is present. Although I've been knocking it back a little bit, and I tried to allow him to have an opportunity to do some stuff, but it didn't seem like he was really taking advantage of the opportunities that I was giving him. So I went ahead and I tried to put him in a bow and arrow choke, and he actually managed to navigate out of it. I was so impressed. Because, he's a lower belt guy, and as a matter of fact, I don't even think he's 18 yet, because he's still wearing a green belt. So, for him to have the sense of mind like that, to be able to roll out of it wasn't exactly a secure bow and arrow choke. I could have had it a lot tighter, but the way that he got out of it, very low effort. I thought it was so fucking smart. I'm like, yeah. If I'm ever in that position, I hope I remember to do it just like that. Yeah, and so, the people that go about their jiu-jitsu with like an ego that, I know everything and I can't learn anything from a green belt or a white belt. Are you kidding me? Half of the time they don't know what they're doing, and so when they do something, sometimes it'll just be on instinct, and it'll be so fucking slick that you wish you had a fucking video camera. Half the time that's what happens to me. It's like, if I pulled one good escape today that I really wish there was a fucking video camera on me, because I would have wanted to have trained that and repped that for maybe an hour or so. But like I said, it's like, there's something to be found in all of jiu-jitsu. When it doesn't matter how fast or how hard your opponent is playing, it's like, where is their energy going? Are they more defensive? Are they more offensive? Are they just waiting for you to fuck up? And my second opponent, he's very, very strong, very, very wiry. Had his grips tight. So, tight enough that it made me wonder if that white belt he's wearing is the first white belt that he's ever had, at least in jiu-jitsu. So, I don't know, there's a feeling that I get when I'm rolling with some people, and it could just be that they're putting in that many more hours on open mat or something. But, yeah, I get this impression every once in a while. It's like, okay, this guy did 4 years of high school fucking wrestling before he came in here. This guy did some NCAA time in wrestling. This guy went to the Olympics in wrestling, or this guy knows some judo, or this guy knows some jiu-jitsu. He normally trains no-gi, but he's in my gym as a fucking white belt, and no telling how long he's been training the 10th planet, because they don't really do the belts the same way. Anyway, point being that the skill differential is sometimes felt by me. And so, yeah, I was definitely feeling that today. He was definitely on it with regard to his grips. Very, very tight technique. And, so I felt like I was kind of in trouble. Despite the fact that I got that blue belt on and he's got a white belt on, the fact of the matter is, his game was really on it today. And it wasn't until, although I feel like I wore him out, that he had tried several submission attempts and he was going really fast. As a matter of fact, he went so fast trying to get an arm bar on me, he ended up kicking me in the head trying to get his foot over. And my only feeling on that was like, is this guy trying to hurt me? Because the fact of the matter is, if my head wasn't in the way, he would have reared back on that fucking armbar trying to get it. And I don't know that I would have had enough time to tap before, he was like hurting my arm and shit. So I'm kind of glad that I had my head right where I had it, took the foot, kept him from doing the full armbar, and yeah, I was able to get a nice defensive wrap on his thigh. Although I did have it in kind of a weird position. I didn't have it in that first position that we were talking about. I had it to where his thigh was down, his knee was up, and I had it wrapped with a gable grip to the outside. And so what I did then was I grabbed the thigh of his pants and pulled downward and just assumed a nice good side control from it. But anyway, like I said, I was feeling a bit of a skill differential with this guy. Definitely a lot faster and a little bit stronger than I was anticipating. Certainly more skilled than I was giving him credit for. But nonetheless, everything got straightened out. And at the end, like I said, I think I had him tired out because he was just holding in a really tight defensive position. And I know now what I should have done because I had him on his belly and he had both of his arms clasped in front of him. What I should have done is grab the like if he had his right arm on top of his left arm, to grab the right wrist with my left arm. And that's really important because you can pin both of their arms with the one arm that's on top. And so I did that one time on somebody else, and I'd managed to get them to where I had their back. And, just using that wrist as leverage. You pull it into your chest, then you get your hook on the one side, and you just roll out. And you pull them right up on top of you, and you're in a nice position for a back take. But, yeah, I tell you what, he almost got my back a couple times. And it was only because I was really, really keen to push that knee out from under me and do that hip jump and get out and over that thigh. That's the only reason he didn't get my back today. Anyway, let's go ahead and throw down with some music. And as far as where we're going to go first, it's going to be some body count. But I think this one's appropriate. Talk shit, get shot. Here on Coin Metal, First Dance. And that was Machine Head with I'm Your God Now. Anywho, I started writing something. I'd come across a interesting piece of information not too long ago. And it was something that I'd read a long time ago in its first iteration. As a matter of fact, the first time that I saw this, and I hope that I never got rid of it, because there was a friend of mine from high school, and it was a really interesting time in high school. It was that time at the end of your senior year, where like there's this period where you've got all of your prerequisites done, and you're just sucking up time. The time that you could be spending doing other things. Like they really don't count tardiness against you and shit like that, especially if you're already done. Like, that's one of the things that I loved about high school. I had the greatest high school counselors ever. I mean, if you were so lucky as to be having such good counsel in high school, you should consider yourself lucky, and you should take full advantage. Not that I expect that children are listening to this, but if you are, and you're in high school, and you've got a really good counselor, take full advantage of that, please. And I don't mean like abuse their trust and shit like that. I mean like, give to them, and they will give to you if they're a good one. And I had such a counselor, and in my freshman year, I'd always had trouble in school, and so they were bumping me along kind of from junior high. Actually, I was done with junior high about 6 months before I was actually out of junior high. So, I had really good counselors there too. And basically, what they would do is they would front load all of my classes. So, like, during the school year, I would do all of my hardcore prerequisites within the first 2 semesters, and then I would have at least a semester to fuck off and pretty much do whatever I wanted to as far as my extracurriculars and all that. And I had a special deal going with my counselor, and the first semester he'd made this deal with me. Because he noticed that I was having an additional amount of trouble, and he had said to me that if I performed X, he would give me Y, and the Y was basically any class that I wanted to go to, and it didn't matter which class it was. And so I thought long and hard about that one. I mean, I'm a freshman in high school. I got fucking carte blanche of the entire. I could take art classes. I could take everything, right? So, me being slightly smarter than average, decided to take auto mechanics. And so he said, "All right, so you are going to perform this, and I am going to get you into auto mechanics." Now, what makes this an especially special feat? And when I said it, his eyebrows just kind of like jumped up onto his forehead, because, like, I laid it on the table right there, And the thing about auto mechanics in my high school at that time was that traditionally auto mechanics classes started with junior year. You could go in sophomore year, but they preferred that you started it in your junior year, and then go through your senior year, and so on. So anyway, me getting this in my freshman year was kind of special. I was like asking him for the gold crown, and he's like, "You better fucking perform." And so I did. I held up my end of the bargain, and he held up his. Unfortunately, I didn't get in until the 3rd semester, but it was interesting in that they were already started on stuff, but I meshed right in with it. Anyway, the point being was, in high school, I had gotten so much of my prerequisites done that basically my senior year was mine. I got everything done. Like, most of my heavy shit, my heavy lifting was done by my sophomore year. And that's just how good my counselors were. They stacked all kinds of shit on me. They rode me like a donkey, but I performed. So, that's how it goes. You give, you get. So anyway, junior year comes around. I'm just flying by, and I started doing extracurricular stuff. So for auto mechanics, I'd already done advanced auto mechanics in my sophomore year. Dude, I was off campus at this place called Southern California Regional Occupational Center. I was training for my ASC certification before I even was graduating high school. I fucked up on one thing in high school, and that was it. Is I should have finished that auto mechanics class instead of going to machine tool my last term, because then I would have gotten my ASC certification. I'd have been 17 years old, graduated high school with an ASC certification. That's not a small feat. Anyway, so where I was going with that is, because we were in this flux in the last semester of high school, basically there was no assignment schedule or anything like that. We'd already gone through the assignment stuff for the year, and we were just fucking off time. And so this one guy, Darren, he had been fucking off campus, and so I hadn't been seeing him very much. And so one day he shows up, and I think it was because it was like the last day of official class before we started going into graduation ship. And he's got this backpack with these reams of this text. And this text is called "The Emperor Wears No Clothes." It's by Jack Harrer. And anyway, the version that I saw of it was a ream of paper. I think it was like 45 pages, maybe a little bit shorter than that. But I mean, it was all of the information that ended up in this version of "The Emperor Wears No Clothes." Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, maybe I couldn't tell you. But the version I saw was like 1989 or 1988, 1989 was when it was printed. So this book has been around. It's free online. You can find it. "The Emperor Wears No Clothes," Jack Harrer. If you really want to know the big push in the history of cannabis in America, you should read that. It's not all that long, and it's action-packed information. Anyways, as far as action-packed information for crypto, we got plenty of that today. And as a matter of fact, let's see. I'm not really sure where I want to start with this stuff, because I've got this report, and we talked about it last time, but I couldn't find it. And I looked around, and I asked somebody on Twitter, and they delivered. And so here it is. This is on research-creditsuisse.com. It's on Credit Suisse's webpage. Global Money Notes number 26, Countdown to QE4. And this is by Zoltan Poznar, or Pozsar. My apologies, Zoltan. Interesting first name. And let's see, when was this thing authored? I don't know, it'll probably give us some sort of date reference in here. But it's about 11 pages, and I think we can hammer it down. So let's go for it. Global Money Notes number 26, Countdown to QE4. The Fed's liquidity operations have not been sufficient to relax the constraints banks will face in the upcoming year-end turn. Reserves are still insufficient. There are no true excess reserves, and large U.S. banks' GSIB scores are shaping up to be a severe binding constraint heading into the year-end turn. We have never had a year-end without a comfortable buffer of excess reserves, or when the GSIB scores could force most U.S. banks to turn off market making. The FX swap market shows implied yields that don't imply a bad year-end turn, yet it is the most exposed to liquidity and balance sheet constraints. The apparent lack of concern may come from last year's benign experience, and that repo rates have been trading normally since the September blowout. But these facts are less relevant than they seem. Last December, U.S. banks still had plenty of excess reserves to lend and had no GSIB constraints. And that liquidity operations have kept a lid on repo rates since September doesn't mean that they will be effective as balance sheets bind going into year-end. The FX swap market becoming unglued is the biggest risk for RV hedge funds' assumption that they will have balance sheet to fund their bond basis trades around the year-end turn and not too punitive rates, if at all. They've lined up forward-setting sponsored repo trades to lock up balance sheet for the turn, but they don't know the rates they'll have to pay on those trades, or if the banks will be able to fund these trades, and they are missing the incentives at play, which is that dealers selling settling sponsored repos over the turn have an incentive to introduce an imbalance in collateral markets to maximize the value of whatever excess reserves their bank operating subsidiary has left to lend over the turn. In turn, the dealers' hedge funds expect to stand between them and the Fed to bridge the above imbalance may not be there for them if the FX swap market becomes unglued and offers better yields than GC repos. If we're right about funding stresses, the Fed will be doing QE4 by year end. The safe asset U.S. Treasuries is funded by RV hedge funds on the margin, and if the FX swap market pulls balance sheet and funding away from them, the safe asset will go on sale. Treasury yields can spike into year end, and the Fed will have to shift from buying bills to buying what's on sale, coupons. Important information. This report represents the views of the Investment Strategy Department of Credit Suisse and has not been prepared in accordance with the legal requirements designed to promote independence of investment research. It is not a product of the Credit Suisse Research Department, and the view of the Investment Strategy Department may differ materially from the views of the Credit Suisse Research Department and other divisions at Credit Suisse, even if it references published research recommendations. Credit Suisse has a number of policies in place to promote the independence of the Credit Suisse research departments from Credit Suisse's independent investment strategy and other departments, and to manage conflicts of interest, including policies relating to dealing ahead of the dissemination of investment research. These policies do not apply to the views of investment strategists contained in this report. I wonder whose views it does. Let's see here. December 9th, 2019. Okay, there we go. Part 1, liquidity operations doesn't equal excess reserves. The payment system used to be a credit system, where bankings routinely incur daylight overdrafts, that is, negative balances, in their reserve accounts at the Fed. The Fed's interday credit provision to the payment system ensured that payments between banks never bounced. Large money center banks like JP Morgan Chase Bank were the biggest and the most active users of daylight overdrafts, and once deep overnight Fed funds market was where large banks with negative reserve balances borrowed from small banks with positive reserve balances to get the reserves necessary to pay down their daylight overdrafts at the Fed by sunset. The payment system morphed into a token system under Basel III. As liquidity rules require large money center banks, which under Basel III we call globally symmetrically important banks, or GSIBs, to pre-fund their 30-day outflows, interday liquidity needs and resolution liquidity needs. The liquidity war chest of GSIBs is held either in a reserve account at the Fed or in treasuries. Intraday liquidity needs and resolution liquidity needs can only be met with reserves, whereas 30-day outflows can be met with both reserves and treasuries and variations on their respective themes. Overnight repos, where banks swap reserves at the Fed for treasuries reversed in 4 a day, and FX swaps, where banks swap reserves at the Fed for reserves at the BOJ or the ECB. Under Basel III, banks would never incur daylight overdrafts at the Fed, for if we were to, they would be in breach of either their intraday liquidity needs or resolution liquidity needs. This means that under Basel III, the system clears with permanent reserves in circulation, as no bank has an incentive to borrow temporary reserves from the Fed on the margin. The bank that has the most reserves in a token system functions as the system's lender of next to last resort, absorbing imbalances by lending some of its reserves via repos and FX swaps on the margin, but not all of its reserves. Since banks can meet their intraday and resolution liquidity needs only with reserves, reserves held for those liquidity needs aren't available for lending. It follows that a bank's ability to serve as the system's lender of next to last resort comes down to its reserves in excess of its intraday and resolution liquidity needs. Put differently, the excess reserves of the lender of next to last resort ensure that repo and FX swap markets have a backup. The concept of excess reserves is therefore an oxymoron. As the lender of next to last resort's excess reserves are someone's required reserves and make the difference between money markets trading normally or falling into disarray. Given that JP Morgan was by far the largest user of daylight overdrafts before Basel III, it should not be a surprise that it became the largest holder of reserves under Basel III. If daylight overdrafts were the shock absorber that allowed the payment system and by extension the repo and FX swap markets to deal with imbalances and clear seamlessly, it follows that if under Basel III no bank would ever tap the Fed for daylight overdrafts. JP Morgan's excess reserves became the system's shock absorber. JP Morgan's dominance in repo and FX clearing meant that it had to hold more excess than other banks. Its portfolio of excess reserves was the Bakken shale of global dollar funding markets. Thus, in a payment system that functions as a token system, and uneven distribution of reserves is the natural state. Basically, I want to pause here. Basically, that sets up JP Morgan as like the setter of the rate. And they could be like comping themselves on the backside by, providing favorable rates on either end. Favorable to themselves, that is. Thus, in a payment system that functions as a token system, an uneven distribution of reserves is the natural state. Upset that state by flattening the distribution of reserves, and you get rid of you rid the financial system of its lender of next to last resort. Taper and repeated cuts to the interest on reserves (IOR) rate were deliberately designed to eliminate excess reserves and flatten the distribution of reserves in the financial system. And that's precisely what caused the September storm in the repo and FX swap markets. The Fed has been slow to recognize the full implications of this situation, but in September, it learned that when excess reserves are shredded through taper and the distribution of excess reserves is flattened through repeated cuts to the IOR rate, the system is left without a lender of next to last resort, and without such, a lender the repo and FX swap markets can hit an air pocket, and the many entities that fund through those markets can't get things done. Treasury can't fund the deficits and pay its bills. Dealers can't fund their treasury inventories or their clearing accounts to make markets. And the world can't fund to get the US dollars to pay for goods or to roll their FX hedges. If carry makes the world go round and reserves make carry possible, the day we run out of reserves would be the day when the world would stop spinning. No, this is not an overstatement. When Southeast Asia ran out of US dollar reserves in 1997, the world did stop spinning in Southeast Asia. Back then, the binding constraint was FX reserves, US dollars in nostro accounts at large money center banks in New York. Today, the binding constraint is excess reserves, the reserves that GSIBs hold in their reserve accounts at the Fed in excess of their regulatory requirements. When the money runs out, pegs get broken. In Southeast Asia, we broke FX pegs. In September, we broke overnight pegs, that is, the target range for the overnight rates complex. To paraphrase Lou Mannheim's character, quote, "We looked into the abyss. There was nothing stirring back at us. And at that moment, the Fed, with some delay, did the right thing, and that was what kept us out of the abyss. And that's what kept the world spinning." The Fed became lender of last resort to dealers as JP Morgan ran out of reserves to lend, and the primary financier of the government, as $250 of the $275 billion of the reserves that's been put into the system since September, ended up in Treasury's general account. See Figure 1. We're not going to. Thus, all of the Fed's liquidity operations have done to date is to ensure that the Fed's cash needs don't drain further liquidity from banks. HOLA portfolios, HQ, is that HQLA? Yeah, that's HQLA portfolios, but did not inject excess reserves into the banking system ahead of the year-end turn. That's another mistake in the making. Under Basel III, year-end turns mark difficult to get through periods where the balance between balance sheet constraints and excess reserves determine where turns get priced. Always and everywhere, excess reserves are what enable repo and FX swap markets to clear when foreign banks window dressing their leverage ratios stop making markets. When foreign banks stop borrowing in money markets to lend via repos and FX swaps, the market participants they've lent to would temporarily turn to JP Morgan for funding. On the Fed's balance sheet, year-end flows would typically show up as liability swaps, where reserves drop and money funds use of the overnight RRP facility spikes in equal amounts. On JP Morgan's balance sheet, year-end flows would show up as asset swaps, where the above loss of revenues is filled by JP Morgan swapping its excess reserves for treasuries through repos and for deposits at the ECB and the BOJ through FX swaps. Thus, as the overnight RRP facility sterilized the reserves through foreign banks did not have the balance sheet to intermediate. JP Morgan stepped up the lending of its excess reserves. This way, the aggregate reserves actively floating in the financial system did not change, only its mix. As some active reserves got sterilized, some excess reserves got activated, but at a price. Like the price of an Uber on a rainy day, surge pricing went into effect to mobilize excess reserves, a practice we've referred to as fracking in previous issues. The growth of sponsored repos since 2018 changed some of these year-end dynamics, as the reserves that went on to the overnight RRP facility in the past now remain in the system, as sponsored repo enables some banks to circulate them without using balance sheet. Figure 2 shows how year-end spikes in the overnight RRP facility migrated to sponsored repo and how the system went from sterilizing reserves on year-ends to retaining more of them. As more reserves were retained in the repo market, fracking became less profitable. The FX swap market had more excess reserves and a better year-end turn in 2018, which made large U.S. banks spend all of their excess reserves on treasuries during 2019. Figure 3 shows the rotation from excess reserves to collateral in banks, HOLA portfolios. Since the beginning of the Fed's balance sheet taper, large U.S. banks like JP Morgan, that are central to year-end flows, sent some $350 billion of excess reserves on collateral. Truly excess reserves are thus gone, but dealers and banks loaded up on collateral as a trade they were supposed to be taken out of by eventual coupon purchases by the Fed, but the Fed never did that, and for the first time we're heading into a year-end turn without any excess reserves. Don't fight the Fed, you say. They are adding liquidity through repos and bill purchases, and what's not in the system now will be there on year-end, and the turn will be just fine. Not so fast. What we need for the turn to go well are balance sheet neutral repo operations or asset purchases aimed at what dealers bought all year. Coupons, not bills. The former to get around foreign banks' balance sheet constraints around year-end, and the latter to ensure that excess reserves accumulate with large banks like JP Morgan. Unfortunately, the Fed is doing neither. Repo operations are done through the tri-party system, which means they aren't nettable, which in turn means that once balance sheet constraints start to bind around year-end, foreign dealers will take less liquidity from it to lend it to those in need on the periphery. Central bank liquidity is useless unless primary dealers have balance sheet to pass it on, and that they've been passing it on since September doesn't mean they will at year-end. Bill purchases are also ill-conceived because banks and dealers don't own any bills, and so don't have anything to sell to the Fed to boost their excess reserves ahead of year-end. In our view, the notion that bill purchases will force money funds down the yield curve to buy short coupons from primary dealers who would then pay off their repos with banks so that banks could build up some excess reserves into year-end involves too many moving parts, and Murphy's Law applies to money markets too. In our view, once the Fed's bill purchases push yields below the overnight RRP facility rate, there are about 10 basis points to go. Figure 4. The reserves entering the system won't flow down the curve and up to the banks, but up the curve and down the drain to the overnight RRP facility where reserves get sterilized. Money market funds need a steeper money market curve to start buying short coupons, but with the Fed done with rate cuts for now, more slope is not in the cards. In turn, if overnight repos and short coupons yield the same, money funds will choose repos with dealers until there is balance sheet, and with the Fed when balance sheet constraints flare up and start to bind into year-end. In summary, year-end balance sheet constraints will preclude primary dealers from bidding for reserves from the Fed through the repo facility or through repos from money funds. The slope of money market curves suggests that excess reserves won't build up at banks, and so U.S. banks will not be able to fill the market-making vacuum left by foreign banks. Part 2. G-SIB scores and the flow of excess reserves. Running low on excess reserves is only one factor that determines how bad the vacuum in market making can get around year-end turns. G-SIB scores are the other, as they determine what banks can do with whatever excess reserves they have at year-end. Lending them through repos, spend them on treasuries, or lend them through FX swaps in that specific order, as repos are less punitive for banks' G-SIB score than for a bank's G-SIB score than FX swaps. My apologies there. U.S. banks are particularly sensitive to their G-SIB scores this year, as they all moved up to a higher surcharge bucket due to bigger treasury holdings and a heavier repo footprint. Every U.S. bank except Morgan Stanley has an incentive to shrink its score into year-end. G-SIB scores are a moving target as they are influenced by markets. The themes pushing G-SIB scores in the wrong direction this year are the equity market rally and the flat curve. Number 1, the rally in equities is inflating scores through G-SIB's market capitalization and the value of equities G-SIBs hold as trading assets or available for sale securities. Number 2, the flat yield curve is inflating scores through G-SIB's bloated treasury portfolios, which, given out auction supply and the equities rally, may grow further into year-end. U.S. G-SIBs can't do a thing about the equity market, and as the largest primary dealers, they also can't not take down more treasuries at auctions if there are insufficient bids, but they can do two things to offset some of the factors that are pushing their scores up. Number 1, collateral upgrades where they collateral upgrades where they repo equities out to raise some excess reserves, or repo or outright sell some of their treasuries to raise some excess reserves. Number 2, clamping down on market making in the FX swap or sponsored repo markets, where they'd add to the vacuum's market making triggered by foreign banks. Note the connection between remedial trades to G-SIB scores and excess reserves. When G-SIB scores are too high and banks need to reduce them, they do so by swapping assets for excess reserves. In other words, when banks hold lots of excess reserves, their G-SIB scores are relatively low and they have room to lend their excess reserves through repos and FX swaps. And conversely, when banks are low on excess reserves, their G-SIB scores are high, and that may force them to clamp down on market making. Excess reserves are gone, and as a result, G-SIB scores are high. And banks are lowering their scores by swapping assets for reserves to scrape together some excess reserves ahead of the year-end turn. And those scrapes are all U.S. banks will have to lend into the market-making vacuum left by foreign banks around year-end. Lending mostly via repos and not FX swaps given their G-SIB scores, but these flows will be scrapes of excess reserves, not bursts from the Bakken shale like in the past, and that's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that collateral upgrades aren't sufficient and U.S. banks stop making markets in FX swaps, and so exacerbate the vacuum triggered by foreign banks. We are on track to realize the worst case scenario, and the market doesn't price for that. According to our conversations with market participants, US G-SIBs rely heavily on Canadian pensions for equity upgrades to accumulate some excess reserves for the turn. Furthermore, some large US banks are selling treasuries to lower their G-SIB scores and scrape together some excess reserves to harvest higher repo rates over year-end. Finally, at least one large US bank appears to be pricing some of its FX swaps trades such that it misses those trades, a polite way of clamping down market-making activities. G-SIB score-related year-end pressures are thus on, and the equity market rally and treasury auctions are the main variables to watch. For every dollar of equities funded with Canadian pensions to reduce one's G-SIB score, a $1 gain in one's market cap or equity inventories forces another upgrade trade, and the more the stock market rallies into year end, the more the demand for upgrade trades, and the higher the rate, where banks will lend scraps of excess reserves over the turn. Similarly, for every dollar of treasuries sold by a bank portfolio to reduce their G-SIB scores, a $1 gain in treasury inventories due to a poor auction can push scores back up. One step forward, one step back. And if markets won't let G-SIB reduce their scores, G-SIBs will resort to scale back market making, like the one U.S. bank that's already pricing FX swap trades to miss them. We do not see the pressure from this in FX swap markets yet, as foreign banks still have balance sheet to pick up the slack, but pressures will come as we get closer to year end. Our point is that the realized turn in FX swap markets will be worse than what is priced by the market, regardless of whether we end up in the best case or worst case scenario. In our view, the FX swap market is expecting too much similarity between the current year-end turn and last year's turn. That's a mistake, as last year's dynamics were different. Number one, large U.S. banks still had excess reserves to lend, but this year they do not. And number two, they got a GSIB relief from a 20% fall in equities, but this year end they do not. Lower G-SIB scores allowed large U.S. banks to spend their hoards of excess reserves on more complex trades like FX swaps, and the year-end turn went down as a non-event in FX swaps, but not repos. Recall that repo printed at least 6.5 on December 31st spot. This year may be the opposite. Higher G-SIB scores will favor repos over FX swaps when deploying excess reserves, but given that the Bakken shale has run dry, repos may still print as bad as last year end, while FX swaps could end up as the orphaned asset class without an obvious backstop, and that may force banks in some parts of the world to the edge of the proverbial abyss. Actually, I think it's going to push a few over. Meanwhile, the relative value RV hedge fund community is certain that they will have a balance sheet to fund their bond basis trades at reasonable rates over the year-end turn. Why? Quote, because we have locked up forward settling sponsored repos with dealers over the turn, and market making in sponsored repos is less likely to be scaled back than in FX swaps. Yeah, but what if the dealers don't have the money? Forward settling sponsored repos are meant to substitute for the balance sheet that the RV hedge funds will lose from foreign banks around year end. But the risk is that RV hedge funds don't allow the rate at which they'll get balance sheet at year end. Forward settling sponsored repos only lock in balance sheet capacity, but not the rate. And, with all due respect, RV funds are ignoring the incentives of repo dealers. Yeah, they're going to jack up and gouge them. The romantic understanding of how sponsored repo works is that a sponsoring dealer sponsors in a unit of cash from a money fund and a unit of cash from an RV hedge fund, and novates both sides of the book to FICC so that the growth of its sponsored repo book does not introduce an imbalance in the repo market. But that's not how things work. That's not the way things work. The real politique of sponsored repo is this. Some sponsors have access to money funds, and some sponsors have access to hedge funds, and the former sponsor the former sponsor cash into FICC, and the latter sponsor collateral into FICC. Thus, the pace at which cash and collateral is being sponsored is never in line, and if collateral is being sponsored in faster than cash, imbalances can arise. Those sponsors that have a large bank operating subsidiary with excess reserves have an incentive to sponsor in collateral in excess of their excess reserves to boost the value of their scraps of excess reserves, and if their scraps run out and forward repos can't be funded, that's not the sponsor's problem, but the RV fund's problem. Without having intelligence about the balance between forward-settling sponsored repos and banks' progress to scrape together excess reserves to fund those forward repos, RV funds don't know where the rate on their forward-settling sponsored repos will print. And given that there are no signs of excess reserves accumulating into year-end, it is likely that the RV community will be taxed excessively to get over the year-end turn. No problem, you say? As the excess reserves missing from bank portfolios will be filled by a small cadre of primary dealers that do not have balance sheet constraints, and they will fill the hole and keep a lid on repo rates. Sure, let's assume for a moment that those primary dealers that are not subject to Basel III, Amherst Pierpoint Securities LLC, Cantor Fitzgerald & Co., and Jeffries LLC, and 3 Canadian dealers whose year-end was on October 31st, the Bank of Nova Scotia, BMO Capital Markets Corp., and TD Securities USA LLC, will save the day by borrowing enough from the Fed to bridge your needs in repo markets? Maybe, maybe not. The risk to this benign and optimistic view is the FX swap market as discussed above. Given that GSIB scores bind and excess reserves are gone, the FX swap market, unlike last year-end, may end up without a lender of next to last resort, and so it will likely trade at implied rates far worse than anything that we've seen in recent year-end turns. If that indeed be the case, the Canadian dealers you expect to lend to you to fund your bond basis trades will lend to the FX swap market instead, and you'll end up short. And you may end up as a forced seller of treasuries. An overarching point is that a dealer is a hedge fund's enabler, not its friend. And dealers that coexist with large bank operating subsidiaries have an incentive to introduce imbalances to the repo market to boost the value of their bank's excess reserves. And dealers that have the balance sheet to take liquidity from the Fed's repo operations will not necessarily do repos with RV hedge funds if FX swaps offer a much better value. Our big picture conclusion is that the safe asset, U.S. Treasuries, is being funded overnight, and therefore it depends on balance sheet to be held and printed. Balance sheet for the safe asset isn't guaranteed around year end, and if balance sheet won't be there, the safe asset will go on sale. Treasury yields will spike. The FX swap market could be the trigger of forced sales of treasuries around year-end, and these funding market stresses will likely pull away capital and hence balance sheet from equity long-short strategies, which could spill over into a broader equity sell-off during the treasury sell-off. That's not the right kind of risk parity Christmas. When these pressures will show up and how long they will last is the last big question, and it's hard to have a definitive answer. It depends. It depends on how equities do, which depends on the trade deal and other random tweets. It depends on how auctions go, which depends on the equity market and the curve slope related to actual funding costs. If the equity market rallies and auctions go poorly, GSIB scores will keep going higher, and the risk that funding market pressures from managing GSIB scores will show up starting the last 2 weeks of the year will last longer than just the spot turn or rising. What? And will last longer than just the spot turn or rising. Dude, this guy, whoever wrote this thing, you need to learn fucking commas. You need to learn your grammar, man. Continuing. We're on page 8 of 11, so we're almost through this thing. Conclusions. The FX swap lines and QE4. Year-end in the FX swap market is thus shaping up to be the worst in recent memory, and the markets are not pricing any of this. Prices don't seem to discount the facts that excess reserves are gone, and the Fed's operations still have not added any, and that GSIB scores are binding and risk large U.S. banks clamping down on market making. Neither does anyone think that the Fed will cut it one more time in December to deliver slope in the money market curve so that reserves from bill purchases flow up to banks, or that the bank will actively encourage the use of FX swap lines around year-end to get around GSIB bottlenecks, or that the Fed will start buying coupons from dealers to inject excess reserves on a balance sheet neutral and GSIB score reducing manner. Something will have to give, and the turn has to get very bad before something gives. If we are right and the Fed loses control over the overnight rates complex going into year-end, not just around the spot, but the weeks leading up to it, what else can the Fed do? Number one, encourage foreign central banks to use the FX swap lines, or number two, start QE4 by switching from buying bills to buying coupons. The FX's swap market lines would get around the GSIB problem directly. If market making in the FX swap markets breaks down due to GSIB related bottlenecks at large banks, flows get kicked higher up in the hierarchy, and central banks become market makers in FX swaps and lend dollars to banks in their jurisdictions at a price of OIS plus 50 basis points, or BPS. I'm assuming that's what that is, but I could be wrong. BPS. So that the world does not stop spinning. Oh man. That just feels like we're on thin ice right there. That response would deal with the potential problems in FX swap markets above head-on and ensure that the reserves taken by a select group of dealers from the repo facility around year-end flow into the repo market to fill the funding needs of the RV hedge funds. QE4 would help through the back door by reversing the mistake of balance sheet taper. QE4 would mean buying back from dealers and banks the treasuries they were forced to buy during the balance sheet taper and giving back the reserves they gave up in the process. QE4 would re-liquefy HQLA portfolios by trading securities for excess reserves. the excess reserves that were always needed to get through year-ends seamlessly, and which the system's liquidity profile and U.S. banks' G-SIB scores need desperately. QE4 would refill the Bakken shale in an instant, as primary dealers stuck with treasuries would pay off their repos with JP Morgan, and that would bring us back to the natural state of the token system. That is, a state where the distribution of excess reserves is uneven once again, and where JP Morgan is the system's lender of next to last resort once again. Why is that better than the Fed? Because JP Morgan has the right set of pipes. It lends into FICC and the Fed does not. Because JP Morgan is pragmatic. It buys coupons when it has to, and the Fed does not. QE4, as much as it makes sense, won't happen unless the Fed's hands are forced, and not responding to potential stresses in the FX market with the swap lines may be what forces the Fed's hands. It will take the swap lines to help RV hedge funds to roll their positions without the risk of fire sales. Not encouraging their use preemptively can lead to fire sales where QE4 goes live as a cleanup operation, with the Fed buying what the RV funds are forced to sell, and what they could have bought from dealers under normal circumstances, as dealers have been politely asking the Fed since September, just like they were asking for a repo facility before that, and we know how that ended. No, I don't. Oh, wow. That's a really interesting chart right there. And chart. And we're down to the bottom, 11 of 11. Additional important information. This material has been prepared by the Investment Strategy Department personnel of Credit Suisse, identified in this material as contributors, and not by Credit Suisse's research department. The information contained in this document has been provided as general market commentary only and does not constitute any form of personal advice, legal, tax, or other regulated financial service. It is intended only to provide observations and views of the Investment Strategy Department which may be different from or inconsistent with the observations and views of Credit Suisse Research Department analysts, other Credit Suisse departments, or the proprietary positions of Credit Suisse. Observations and views expressed herein may be changed by the Investment Strategy Department at any time without notice. Credit Suisse accepts no liability for losses arising from the use of this material. This material does not purport to contain all of the information that an interested party may desire, and in fact, provides only a limited view of a particular market. It is not investment research or a research recommendation for regulatory purposes, as it does not constitute substantive research or analysis. The information provided is not intended to provide a sufficient basis on which to make an investment decision and is not a personal recommendation or investment advice. While it has been obtained from or based on sources believed by the trader or sales personnel to be reliable, each of the trader or sales personnel and Credit Suisse does not represent or warranty its accuracy or the completeness, and is not responsible for losses or damages arising from the use of this material. Yeah. And so, yeah, we're just going to go ahead and drop it there, because this is like, oh, this is important. Quote, the end. This report may not be reproduced in whole or in part without the written permission of Credit Suisse. Copyright 2019 Credit Suisse AG. Yeah, whatever. We're not trying to make any profit off of it, and we didn't read the entirety of it. But the point being is that this does give us some insight into what's going on with the Fed and with the markets at large. And it seems to me that there's a liquidity leak somewhere. That the liquidity isn't refreshing into these equities markets, and it's not refreshing into their traditional bits of liquidity that they need flowing into the fucking market to make everything swap right. The swap market and the FX market, they're running out of liquidity somewhere. It's going out somewhere. Somebody's buying too much coke, somebody is dating too many hookers, somebody's buying too much Bitcoin. I don't know. But there appears, in my opinion anyway, to be some huge liquidity leaks in these markets. And I would wager that they exist at JP Morgan, that the leak is happening at the exchange rates that they're setting. When they're in that comfy little position where they're the lender to the market of next to last resort, they're the first ones that anybody goes to. They go to them before they go to the Fed, right? That's a real comfy position for JP Morgan to be in. So really, is it against their interest to adjust the markets to where they end up being, or maintaining that position of being the lender of next to last resort? It's like I said, it's a real comfy position, but I would suspect that they are the point where the tweak is happening. And this does seem to be their modus operandi. They were caught relatively recently manipulating the silver markets and also other physical metals markets for about 15 to 20 years, and some accuse that it's been going on much longer than that. I don't doubt it. JP Morgan's been around for a long motherfucking time. But the point being that they are it's like their modus operandi. I would bet like cash money, in whatever form you want, that somehow or another JP Morgan is related to Tether and or some other major quote unquote stable coin, and they're pulling the same fucking fraud that they're pulling everywhere else, where they put themselves in the position where they're setting the rate. They're dictating to the rest of the market what the rate is at any one time. And there could be a float going there from the in to the out that you have no idea about, that goes beyond the standards accepted and accounted for by other market participants. I.e., they are taking a bigger fucking cut on the exchange rate. This has been happening in Bitcoin, and you can look at any fucking chart and see it. I don't care which coin you're looking at. If it's been in existence like since 2015, you can see it. You can see the up down where all that liquidity is sloshing back and forth between alts and Bitcoin and dollars and Bitcoin and alts and dollars and alts, and you can see it, right? But then all of a sudden you see that up and down volatility turn into a fucking straight flat line. That happened since the existence of stable coins, which I have asserted all this time are nothing but counterfeit money. They don't even have the fucking backing for it. They've got a complicit exchange that's willing to dictate the exchange rate to the rest of the market, and the rest of the market has no other indicators of exactly how much that shit's worth because we can't audit the underlying reserves. It's fucking bullshit. It should not be allowed in crypto. I can account for how much Bitcoin I have at any one point in time. I can't account for how many fucking Tether there are at any one time. Or if I can't account for how many US dollars they actually have sitting in a fucking bank account backing up those fucking Tether that are circulating in the market. And I've said this multiple times, but I do not believe that they have $4 billion sitting in a fucking bank account or bank accounts or even reserves in fucking liabilities that other people owe them money and shit, which they've been counting as money. It's basically the circle jerk butt fuck that's going on in the rest of the markets out there, and I'm really disappointed that there's not more outcry about it, because like I said, you can see it on any fucking altcoin chart. You see it, man. It's up, down, and then it's like flatline, man. Like somebody pulled the plug on that fucking patient. Anyway, let's go ahead and throw back down into some music. And as far as where we want to go, I've been dying to play some fucking Melvins, man. And so, let's see. I haven't had an opportunity to listen to this album, and so this is as much a shoot in the dark for me as it is for you. And so here it is, Night Goat, off Houdini by Melvins, here on Coin Metal. And that was Eamon Amarth, I'm sorry, I don't listen to him that much. But Crack the Sky was the name of the song. So there you go. Anywho, so we just got over talking about how fucked the Fed market may be, or the markets in general between the banks, the intra-bank trading, as we just went over that. But we have other things. And so, we were talking about the borrowing markets and all that business. I want to get into something else, though. This is another PDF. This is a different type of monetary policy here, or at least a different angle on it. And you know what? I don't even know if I'm going to be able to do this one instead of other stuff, because I had other stuff on here, a whole bunch of shit on here, honestly. That one, wasn't it? Yeah, I think I could do this one. Here we go. This is kind of a reaffirmation, and then there's another thing I want to get into on this too. So, this one's on Zero Hedge, and we're gonna see if we can find the actual source. Because I like to give proper attribution. It's not always Tyler Durden. Sometimes it's even a woman. So, Anyway, this was on economicprism.com. Banana Republic Money Debasement in America. And this is posted on December 13th, 2019 by M.N. Gordon. And let's check and verify something here. M.N. Gordon. Blah, 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 blah. And no indication of... here, wait a minute. Nope. No indication of genitalia. So we're just going to go for it. There are many falsehoods being perpetrated these days when it comes to money, financial markets, and the economy. But when you cut the chaff, 3 related facts remain. Uncle Sam needs your money. He needs a lot of your money, and he needs it bad. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal budget deficit for the first 2 months of the fiscal year 2020 is $342 billion. This amounts to $36 billion more than the deficit recorded during the same period last year. At this rate, Washington's going to add over $1 trillion to the national debt in fiscal year 2020. Still, the figures from the CBO aren't all that bad. Revenues in October and November of 2019 were 3% higher than they were in October and November of 2018. Regrettably, outlays for these 2 months were 6% higher in 2019 than they were in 2018. Jack and Jennets both know from experience that taking 3 steps forward and 6 steps back is an inefficient way to lose ground. They also know that the longer this goes on, the more ground you lose. So too, they know that the more ground you lose, the harder it is to make up. For example, after the 3 big budget items, Medicare, Social Security, and Defense, defense comes interest on debt. Presently, interest on debt is over $375 billion. However, the debt is growing by over $1 trillion a year. By this, the Treasury is losing ground. Moreover, when interest rates rise, and as the pile of government debt approaches $40 trillion over the next decade, interest on the debt will quickly jump to well over $1 trillion. This will put merely the interest on debt at par with expenditures for Medicare and Social Security, as well as above defense. This is why Uncle Sam needs your money. But how he gets your money is a recipe for disaster. Dotards Anonymous. President Trump doesn't want to raise taxes, especially in an election year. He wants to cut taxes, because voters love tax cuts, as long as they're not for the rich. The proven method for a presidential incumbent to stay in office is to cut taxes and increase spending. That is precisely what Trump is doing. Spending is increasing 2 times faster than revenue. So, how will Uncle Sam get your money? He'll get it by doing more of what he's already doing. He'll get it via greater and greater deficits. When Uncle Sam expends the money supply through deficit spending, he effectively dilutes wealth from the dollar. But for Uncle Sam, it doesn't matter if he waters down the dollar to a light beer. He gets the newly created money first, and he gets to spend it while the money can still lay claim to real labor and resources. John Maynard Keynes succinctly clarified, quote, "By continuing processes of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens." In practice, the increase in the money supply leads to a reduction in purchasing power per monetary unit. So, without levying taxes, Washington confiscates your wealth, your stored time and productivity in return for debased money. Still, this doesn't solve the problem of taking 3 steps forward and 6 steps back. Instead, it makes it worse. As the nation ages and the interest on the debt consumes more and more of the budget, the economy weakens like an anonymized dotard, or an anonymous dotard. Yet this isn't the half of it. Banana Republic on money debasement in America. You see, the U.S. debt-based fiat money system, which is dependent on greater and greater issuances of Fed credit, is set up for ultimate failure and disaster. Yet, the road to this endgame, as we discover more and more every day, is paved with madness. This week, for example, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, dotards of the XE/XEM/XYR genderqueer pronoun identity, published their latest schedule of overnight and term repurchase agreement operations. This in short lays out how much fake money they're going to print up and give to the big banks through January 14th, 2020. Cutting through the minutia and tabbing it up is mind-numbing. Fortunately, Zero Hedge, astute fellows of the he, him, his cisgender pronoun identity were up to the task. Quote, according to the statement, the NY Fed will continue to offer 2-week term repo operations twice per week, 4 of which span year-end. And, in addition, the desk will also offer another long maturity term repo operation that spans year-end. The amount offered in this operation will be at least $50 billion. Quote, in addition to prevent a cascading year-end liquidity squeeze, Fed overnight repo operations will continue to be held each day, and just to be safe, the Fed will go to town by substantially expanding their size. On December 31st, 2019 and January 2nd, 2020, the overnight repo offering will increase to at least $150 billion to cover the turn in a flood of overnight liquidity. In addition, on December 30th, 2019, the desk will offer a $75 billion repo that settles on December 31st, 2019, and matures on January 2nd, 2020. Gosh, weren't we just reading a report that said they really needed that fucking liquidity, bro? So Christmas comes. Quote, and just in case that isn't enough, the NY Fed Markets desk also added that, quote, it intends to adjust the timing and amounts of repo operations as needed to mitigate the risk of money market pressures that could adversely affect policy implementation consistent with the directive from the FOMC. So yeah, keep them above their constraints, as we were talking about in the previous article. Quote, what the Fed means is that in addition to expanding the sizes of its turn overnight, repos to $150 billion, the Fed will conduct a total of 9 term repos covering the year-end turn from December 16th to January 14th, 8 of which will amount to $35 billion, and the first will be $50 billion, for a total injection of a whopping $365 billion in the coming month. Quote, there's more. And add in the incremental liquidity from the expanded overnight repo of about $50 billion and another $60 billion in T-bill purchases, and the Fed will inject a total of just shy of $500 billion in the next 30 days. Quote, this also means that by January 14th, the Fed's balance sheet will have grown by a cumulative $365 billion in temporary repos. That's equivalent to $1 billion a day. And together with the expanded overnight repos and the $60 billion in monthly T-bill purchases, and mid-January the Fed's balance sheet, currently at $4.066 trillion, will surpass its all-time high of $4.5 trillion. This, without question, constitutes mass money debasement of the likes typically reserved for banana republics. Somehow we think all this funny money is needed to help to keep the U.S. Treasury flush with cash. Moreover, if this $500 billion madness is needed just to get to January 14th, what madness will be needed come January 15th? Our guess? Take the current number and double it, then double it again. Sincerely, M.N. Gordon from Economic Prism. Ooh, and this has responses. 6 responses. Let's see here. Dwayne Dibley says, everything the Fed does, it does in asset-backed debt-based private credit denominated in dollars, not a U.S. currency. According to the Fed's December 11th, 2019 H41 report, the Fed is holding 3,921,220... Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. Wait a minute. That's not... Whoa. Listen to this. 3,921,225 billion. That's billion in front. That all those numbers in front of billion. So I mean, we're like probably into like quadrillion or something on there. In securities with 256,261 billion of that under reserve repurchase or reverse repurchase agreements, leaving 3,662,964 billion in securities eligible to be pledged to the security to get more legal tender currency if the need arises. Basically, they're liquidating the United States and, yeah, selling it out from under us for repo markets. I don't know how else to put that, really. I mean, come on now. And the sad part about it is that we're seeing this extending into crypto, where they're snatching up the value. And like I said, I really believe it's stable coins doing it, where they're being used to interrupt the exchange rate between national fiat currencies and Bitcoin and Ethereum and other cryptocurrencies. But you can rest assured about one thing. These funny money markets that they're using to slush the monetary value around and rub the pennies together and shit, that liquidity is going somewhere. It's not running out for no reason. They're not having to refresh it with more stimulus for no reason. It's because those funds aren't coming back from the legitimate economy. You're not buying enough cars. You're not buying enough houses. You're not saving enough money. But that's not because you don't want to. It's because you can't fucking afford to. They're sucking the value out of the market right here at the exchange rate of everything. And like we're expected to get by on the nibbles that are left and the devalued dollars that are circulating in the economy. And I really think that on that end of it, they're ripening the world for some sort of collapse on that end. And I don't like to be doomsayer and whatnot, but there's a reason I got into cryptocurrencies. And honestly, it's because in 2008, 2009, I could see this shit coming. Like I heard Peter Schiff talking, and I started paying attention to C-SPAN. And I was listening to these Congressional Budget Office meetings that they actually had on C-SPAN. And they would provide live feeds of representatives from this group, talking to members of Congress and shit. And it's like, okay, that's what's going on. And then I would see it out in my local economy, where the number of jobs being contributed to the local economy was not commensurate with the number of houses being built, which indicated to me that there was some sort of dissymmetry here going on. That people that didn't have money from jobs were getting money from somewhere else to buy houses, or even to build houses, because it costs money to build houses. I painted some of them, I know. I charge money for that. But the point being that there was jobs done, there was work performed, there was money paid. Where that money came from, it's anybody's guess. It could have been banks just making it up out of nothing, and extending credit far beyond their ability to back up with reserves should the people that were taking out those loans default. And I really think we're kind of setting up for the same thing. There's a theory that this stuff is all supposed to work out. That you're supposed to buy a house at $300,000 at 95% leverage, and just because of the increasing value of the property, that you would be able to offset the entire cost of the loan to yourself and still have enough money to get by, because the equity that you have in the house is becoming worth more and more over time. Because so when over 2 years, if it jumps to 500,000, the total equity is 500,000. It's not 300,000. And so you have that 200,000 to pay down the obligation that you have on the total note. And if you're really smart, you're doing that in big ass chunks, so you can cut down your principal payment. So that when that dip comes, okay, and your house is no longer worth $500,000, it's worth $375,000. You've already dropped the principal enough to where your balance payments are low enough to manage. But not everybody did that. They were living off that fucking money. They were living off that differential as it was coming in by the month. So there was no compounding of the value. And the compounding of the value is the thing that causes people to bid it up. Where you could see a house come onto the market at about $575,000, and by the end of all the arbitration and all that shit between the potential buyers, you're looking at $780,000, $920,000 that you're getting off of that house, or the valuation of it. And there was all kinds of bidding up on the market of those notes too, where they were saying that the people that those loans were going to were good for it. And so we're going to take their loan and we're going to put this in a AAA rated tranche. And so, the obligations or the notes that we issue, the tokens, you guys in crypto would understand this, you're familiar with Ethereum. The tokens that we issue against that Ethereum are going to be good for it because the Ethereum's going to be there, right? It's a AAA rated Ethereum thing, although this metaphor doesn't really work, or analogy rather, it doesn't really work for a variety of reasons, but we're not going to get into that. The point being is that the economic activity that the loans are facilitating are supposed to, over time, produce enough in real world value to the rest of the market to offset the initial upfront cost and be profitable in the future. But there's so much concentration on trying to get the money now that like the first 3 years of real value are sucked up in your fucking ICO or your IPO round. I mean, the total valuation is set then, and not necessarily based on what you can actually perform. That's how you end up with like a WeWork, where they've got this wonderful looking book, half of it's fictitious, half of it's bullshit, and none of it's productive. And so over the months, they're draining off that liquidity that they made off of their initial IPO, and they're worth less and less and less and less, and they're not producing enough value, not even in ad revenue, and they're eventually going to collapse. But in the meantime, their CEO's enjoying the ride. That I guess that's the important part, right? Not that they actually produce work, or not that they actually produce jobs, or a job market that works for people or is actually functional. No, none of that matters. They were renting out workspace, and how productive that workspace is depends on what they actually occupy it with. And if they're not putting good startups in there, or letting good startups in, then they're not going to be making enough money to keep the whole shebang going. I think that a lot of the economy is constructed upon such fragile bases. And with cryptocurrencies, at least, when we have something like Bitcoin, okay, you have a real world metric out there in the production of blocks and the processing of transactions and the mempool stats and all that other shit. You have real world information telling you what's going on with that. You don't have that same feedback with US dollars. You have a wide variety of data sets out there with a wide variety of number of people watching them and whatnot, but what you don't have is comprehensive analysis of where all of it is meshing together. And certainly nothing is transparent as the Bitcoin blockchain. If we did, we'd probably find that we're either much happier and much better off than we thought we were, or much more fucked than we'd ever imagined. One of the two. No in between. But yeah, I think the debasement that we've noted due to borrowing and whatnot, and the lack of ability to even maintain the interest payments on them, I think in the longer term, this shit's not going to happen anymore. That what we are going to have is a monetary collapse, and what that will do is that it will cause people to get sober about what they're spending their money on. So boats and hoes, that budget is going to go down because we have to put food in the mouth, right? And you're going to have to pay somebody to grow that food and process that food. And so those homeless people that you see out there, suddenly they're going to become employable because they're people that can move something from point A to point B, and they will be earning a livable wage by then because they will be appropriately paid for it. Putting food in people's mouth will become a much bigger priority than whether or not we can fund the defense budget of Israel. We have a whole set of misalignments in our economy that are causing leak points for the monetary value that should be funding the very engine that provides the lending for the businesses, so you can buy some stock, so you can turn that stock into a profit and pay off the fucking bank and walk away and be able to invest in the next month. That's not happening because that liquidity isn't coming into those markets. It's not coming in to that productive part of the economy. It's going into this financialization bullshit, where we're just stacking debts on top of debts and on top of other people's books. You hear them talking in that one report, how they're tapping the BOJ, they're tapping the ECB. There's all kinds of interdependencies, and not everybody is looking at all the same data. And so, of course, there are entities out there who think they own a lot of shit that they don't really own because there was a previous owner of it that the guarantor didn't bother to contain at one. And so he started assigning multiple owners to the same thing. And when it comes all down to who gets to cash out, his good buddies are going to get to cash out long time before you are. They are going to know way in advance when they're going to be able to walk away from their investments with a profit before you. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. And this hyperinflated down market that we're seeing, when it starts coming due to, who wants to cash out now, I think we're going to see the Dow end up illiquid. That there'll be such a run on the market that the big old tank that we saw during the last financial crisis, that'll look like a fucking inverted pimple, man. You just picked a scab or some shit like that. It'd be like the Grand Canyon by comparison. But never fear. We now have the capability to download some fucking software, run it on our own computers, and turn the computing cycles of our computers into a monetizable unit that has a global market existing and that we will be able to buy goods and services with. But it's getting yourself set up to where you can bring monetary value in and monetary value back out of that system. And it's incumbent upon you to get on the stick and facilitate that for yourself. Anywho, it is with that I'd like to close out this episode. Thank you very much for listening. I certainly do appreciate the support. We will be back again on Monday at 8 p.m. Pacific Standard. Whoa, wait a minute. Hold on. No, we won't. We won't be here on Monday. You know why? Because we're going to be a fucking Static X revival in Portland. But we will be back again on Wednesday at 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And so until then, I want you all to trade safe. Do your homework. And watch out for your own bunghole, because nobody else is going to do it for you. And as far as our last dance is concerned, I want to keep it short and sweet. A little bit of Beastie Boys for us. Last dance, Sabotage, here on Coin Metal. Thank you again for listening, and y'all have an excellent weekend. Good night.